Have you ever walked into a room where everyone has already decided you're going to fail? Not because you're incapable, not because you're unprepared, but because someone somewhere labeled the situation hopeless long before you arrived. That's how this film begins. In a quiet corner of an ordinary high school, there exists what teachers jokingly call an internal legend, a classroom that has survived multiple homeroom teachers, countless parent meetings, and more strategic improvement plans than anyone cares to remember. A class of repeat students, not dangerous, not cruel, just impressively consistent at turning every lesson into an unofficial coffee break. They're the kind of students who can stretch a 5-minute assignment into a philosophical debate about why time itself is a social construct, talented in their own way. And then there's Yumi. She isn't introduced as a superhero. No dramatic slow motion, no triumphant music. Just a woman who has spent enough years in education to know that educational ideals and classroom reality are often in a complicated relationship. She believes in growth, yes, but she also believes in coffee, patience, and realistic expectations. When the administration, after a series of very serious and very ineffective meetings, decides to assign her to the legendary class, the request is framed as an opportunity. Help them graduate. Simple, clean, inspiring. In practice, it feels a little like being asked to organize a parade of cats. The first day is almost poetic. The students sit scattered like independent nations, some scrolling, some staring, some performing the ancient art of looking busy while doing absolutely nothing. They don't glare at Yumi. They don't rebel dramatically. They simply don't care. And indifference, if you've ever experienced it, can be louder than chaos. Yumi stands there, taking it in. She notices the forced boredom, the carefully constructed coolness, the subtle way each student avoids looking too invested. Because caring is risky. Caring means you might try, and trying means you might fail again. What makes this story compelling isn't whether the class will pass their exams. It's whether someone can pass through their emotional defenses. And as Yumi surveys the room, you can almost see the question forming in her mind. Not, how do I control them? But why have they stopped believing this is worth it? That's where the real story begins. Yumi begins the semester the way most teachers do lesson plans prepared, expectations calibrated, somewhere between hopeful and realistic. But very quickly, she discovers that this class does not resist in loud, cinematic ways. There are no dramatic walkouts, no flying chairs, just a quiet, coordinated underachievement. Assignments come back half-finished. Questions are met with shrugs. Group work turns into discussions about weekend plans. It's not chaos, it's disengagement. And psychologically speaking, disengagement is often self-protection. From the outside, it looks like laziness. From the inside, it often feels like fear. These students have failed before, publicly, repeatedly. They carry that history like an invisible transcript stamped across their foreheads. When you've been told directly or indirectly that you're the problem class, it's easier to lean into the role than challenge it. If you expect nothing from yourself, disappointment can't surprise you. Yumi sees this pattern emerging, and here's where the film does something subtle and important. It doesn't portray her as endlessly patient from day one. she gets frustrated. There's a moment when she returns yet another incomplete assignment, and you can see it in her face, the brief flicker of doubt. Am I reaching them at all? We rarely talk about the psychology of teachers, the quiet pressure to prove you're effective, the internal narrative that whispers, if they don't improve, maybe you're not good enough. Yumi feels that too, and that's what makes her human. Instead of doubling down on stricter rules, she experiments with something more uncomfortable, listening. She starts asking questions that aren't on the curriculum. What do you want to do after school? What are you good at outside this classroom? At first, the answers are sarcastic. Sleeping, not math. Avoiding responsibility. The class laughs. Yumi laughs too, not at them, but with them. Humor becomes a bridge. Slowly, she reframes assignments. A literature essay becomes a chance to analyze characters who also feel misunderstood. A math problem becomes a practical scenario tied to real-life goals. She doesn't lower standards. She lowers the emotional stakes. Instead of, you must pass, the message becomes, let's try this together. And here's the quiet psychological shift. When pressure decreases, participation increases. One student who never raises his hand starts offering half answers. Another who hides behind jokes submits an assignment that's actually complete. Not perfect, but complete. The class still tests her. They push deadlines. They negotiate. They observe whether her patience has limits. Because if she eventually gives up like others, it will confirm their worldview. But she doesn't. And that consistency, more than any inspiring speech, begins to unsettle the legend of the hopeless class. There's always a moment in stories like this where progress slows down just enough to test everyone's resolve. For Yumi, that moment arrives right before the midterm evaluations. Up until now, the changes have been subtle but encouraging. More hands raised, fewer blank pages, laughter that sounds less defensive and more alive. It feels fragile but real. And then the scores come back. They're better, but not enough. Not enough to silence the whispers in the staff room. Not enough to satisfy the administration's carefully worded optimism. Not enough to erase the label that has followed this class for years. The students feel it immediately. The old narrative creeps back in. See? This is who we are. A few retreat into silence. One makes a joke about framing the barely passing grade like a trophy. The room shifts, and you can sense the collective temptation to slide back into indifference. It's safer there. Yumi feels the weight too. There's a scene quiet, almost unremarkable, where she sits alone in the classroom after school. The sunlight is fading. Papers are spread across her desk. She isn't angry. She's thinking. This is where the film reaches its emotional peak, not with shouting, but with choice. She could tighten control, assign extra drills, lecture them about effort. That would be understandable, even justified. But she recognizes something deeper. The class doesn't need more proof of their shortcomings. They need proof that improvement counts, even when it's small. She does something unexpected, and this year, there is improvement. Not miraculous, not headline-worthy, but measurable. She doesn't celebrate like they've conquered the world. She simply acknowledges the truth. This is movement, she tells them. And movement matters. The room grows quieter, not with resignation, but with realization. They did something different, and it made a difference. Yumi's superpower isn't perfection, it's consistency. She stays when progress is slow. She notices effort when others notice only results. And in doing so, she challenges the most dangerous belief in that classroom, that they are fixed. The final exams approach, and the tension is real. Not because the audience doubts their intelligence, but because growth requires vulnerability. To try again is to risk failing again. But this time, they show up differently, not as a legendary failure, just as students imperfect, nervous, trying. And sometimes, that's the real climax of any transformation. By the time the final results arrive, the film doesn't treat graduation like a fireworks display. There's no slow-motion sprint down hallways, no exaggerated triumph. Some students pass comfortably, some pass narrowly. A few still struggle, but not in the same way as before. And that's the quiet beauty of the ending. This film isn't just about education, it's about identity. Yumi disrupts that pattern, not with grand gestures, but with steady presence. She models something many of us rarely receive: patience without humiliation, standards without contempt. What makes the ending unexpectedly beautiful is not the certificates or applause. It's a small moment, the once distracted class sitting together, not perfectly organized, but attentive, laughing not to avoid the lesson, but because they understand it. Yumi, too, has changed. She entered thinking her job was to improve them. She leaves understanding that education is mutual. She learned patience at a deeper level. She learned that control is overrated, but consistency is powerful. The film closes without declaring victory. It simply shows movement. A class no longer defined by failure. A teacher no longer questioning her impact. Ordinary people, slightly better than they were yesterday. And maybe that's the most realistic kind of miracle. Not instant transformation. Just someone choosing to stay long enough for growth to feel possible.